So Beyond Light's year started off pretty rough, but by the end of its following 3 seasons, Destiny 2 was headed in at least an interesting direction in both the narrative and quality of life changes. The Witch Queen would be arriving soon, and it was one of the most highly anticipated expansions, with hopes of its quality reaching Taken King and Forsaken levels. Could it live up to those expectations players had? Well, let's first rewind back to the reveal. Like most expansion reveals, they coincide alongside the release of a new season. And this one happened to be the day Season of the Lost launched. And the dev team had a lot to say before we even got a look at the Witch Queen.
The team we have today is committed to relentlessly upgrading this game that we all love. We aren't happy with just another mission. Instead, we want to push the limit of quality you can expect in an action MMO with uniquely Destiny experiences like Expunge and Presage. We are committed to delivering the best mission content that you can play in any game with a friend and having the best feeling action game, period.
The Witch Queen reveal cinematic was very intriguing. The hive-wielding supers like our own, a new swampy throne world, and of course Savathun, the Witch Queen herself, looking badass as hell. The cinematic gave us a lot of questions right away, in a good way. 7 years ago we learned of Savathun during the Taken King, and finally we'd get to see her story front and center of a new expansion. And it appeared to be as mysterious and lore-filled as some of Destiny's best content like Taken King or Forsaken. The first look at gameplay focused on the Hive using the light against us and the potential challenges that faced us. A new weapon type, the glaive, was shown off, and ending with us crushing a Hive ghost. Again, more interesting questions would arise surrounding the Hive obtaining the light. But the reveal wasn't expanding on those questions. Instead, we learned more about the glaive and how it would be obtained. It would actually be built, because weapon crafting would be coming to Destiny 2. A highly requested but somewhat divisive feature that had seen iterations in the past with Destiny 1 and House of Wolves, but it looked like crafting in the Witch Queen would have a bit more depth to it, or at least a bit more grindy, and it was still up in the air at this point whether weapon crafting would be good for the loot game or be to its detriment. Bungie quickly shifted to what would likely be the biggest highlight of the entire expansion, the campaign. There would be a much larger focus on the campaign for the Witch Queen, which was nice to see. There hasn't been too many campaigns in the Destiny franchise that really stood out as great. Most of them were either mediocre or serviceable at best, but campaigns like the Taken King and Forsaken delivered in all the right ways, and Witch Queen was looking to be even more epic than those. A new legendary difficulty option would be added to provide players a much more challenging experience that scaled up in difficulty the more players you had in a fire team. Every mission and boss fight in the campaign would actually be a challenge this time. There weren't a whole lot of major bullet points to cover with the Witch Queen reveal like there were with some of the previous expansions. Instead, Bungie just focused on showing us all the reasons they believe players would be excited. A new large-scale campaign, a villain we've heard so much about, and a new throne world with secrets and light-wielding Hive. Even in the Vidoc that was released just a few weeks before Witch Queen, the campaign was still what Bungie wanted to focus on, giving us a bit more details about both the narrative and the missions themselves, which would have a bit more dungeon-like mechanics involved. We also learned a little bit about the season that would launch alongside the expansion, Season of the Risen. Kaido was going to be helping us push back Savathun's army, but that's all we knew so far. Bungie made a point of how many new items would be arriving in the Witch Queen, including 8 exotic weapons and 6 exotic armor pieces, along with around 50 new legendary weapons to chase. And lastly, the Vidoc ended with a look at the first of 3 subclasses getting an overhaul and update to them. With Witch Queen's launch season, that would be Void. Aspects and Fragments would now be part of the subclasses, just like Stasis subclasses had during Beyond Light, and with each successive season, Solar and Arc subclasses would also receive a similar revamp. So after a 3-month delay, the Witch Queen would launch in late February, and we could finally play it for ourselves and be the judge.
Just don't say I didn't warn you.
So first up, let's talk about the campaign. Did it live up to the expectations Bungie set for it? Was it as grand and as epic as they described? The short answer is yes. There were 8 story missions that were lengthier, more challenging, and more complex than any previous expansion that had come before it. Even the in-between busy work missions were better here. There were a lot of memorable moments throughout in both the gameplay and the narrative, big story reveals, fun boss fights, and the amount of places we ventured throughout the campaign made it feel even bigger. The legendary difficulty made it all the better. It is the definitive way to experience these moments. The challenge and difficulty helped make the whole campaign stick a bit more than previous ones. You had to play your best to defeat the difficult bosses, you had to optimize your playstyle, and utilize all the tools in your arsenal. And all of it just feels better when there's a threat of failure, and the Witch Queen campaign truly felt epic because of it. The new light-bearing hive enemies really helped ramp up the challenge and could be very difficult to deal with, and offered what I would consider real difficulty, rather than artificial difficulty like we see with something like Champions. And it's unfortunate we don't really see these enemies outside of the campaign, patrol, and one of the strikes. The storytelling inside each mission and the various cutscenes were leagues better than what we saw with Beyond Light and Shadowkeep. Bungie definitely didn't oversell the campaign. It was even better than most of us thought it'd be. Now, it wasn't perfect. We'd still end up defeating Savathun in the final mission, rather than fight her in a raid or something like we did with her brother Oryx. Although this time it was a bit more forgivable because of the legendary difficulty and Savathun's boss fight actually being kind of tough and quite the spectacle in the campaign. But like most expansions, after the campaign we of course had a fair amount of quests and things to explore on the new destination. The new world vendor Finch had a few quests that were more of the basic go kill some enemies over here, there, and elsewhere style quest lines. But other post-campaign quests were a bit better, like the evidence boards ones that had us gathering more intel and lore relating to Savathun and would require a bit more effort to complete. A few more weapon crafting quests would also open up, including the Osteostriga quest, which had us building a new weapon of sorrow. But now it's on to the throne world itself, and as a destination, it's alright. Like any new destination, it brought the typical secrets to find and things to uncover, a new public event, you know, the usual stuff. And this time new areas could be accessed when leveling up your rank with Finch by gaining more deep sight, which was pretty cool. But mostly the throne world was filled with a bunch of minor stuff for the sake of the new title to earn, Gumshoe. Savathun's throne world was certainly more fleshed out than Europa or the reprised moon from Shadowkeep, but for some reason it still felt kind of empty and lifeless when comparing to the Dreaming City or Dreadnought. Other activities were also available on the throne world, including the Wellspring, a 6-player matchmade activity that changed a bit each week. Sometimes you'd be defending the zone from an onslaught of enemies and fight one type of boss. Other times you'd be assaulting the zone and end up fighting a completely different boss. It was fun the first few times, but the loot wasn't really all that exciting and only served as a place to farm power level until you reached the soft cap. Altars of Reflection were mini puzzle-like missions that could be completed weekly for powerful drops, and acted the same way that these mini puzzles worked during the campaign. One mission would open up a bit later after the world's first raid was completed, called Preservation, which was essentially just the opening of the raid itself, but could be done solo or in a group of 3, and would grant a pinnacle drop on completion. 2 strikes would also be added in the Witch Queen, both taking place on the new throne world. The birthplace of the Vile, where we would need to fight off the Scorn from accessing the throne world, which they were able to do with the help from the Witness. And the Light Blade, which had us delving deep into the throne world to fight off an old enemy from the Taken King expansion. The Dark Blade, now revived as the Light Blade. These strikes are great both from a gameplay and narrative perspective. They were grand in scale, richly lore-filled, and make for some great challenges on higher difficulties. More strikes like these are what the game needs more often. Continuing the trend from Beyond Light, the Witch Queen also did not bring a new dungeon, which was very unfortunate. The second expansion to launch without a dungeon, which would now be locked behind a separate paywall called the Dungeon Key for $20 extra that would release 2 dungeons later in the year. And it does need to be pointed out how gross it is that Bungie really just keeps splitting up its expansion content more and more into bits and pieces, and then sells those pieces separately. Vow of the Disciple was the new raid that would take place deep inside the pyramid on the throne world. Finally, we'd get to properly explore and navigate through one of these things, and Vow did not disappoint there. It was filled with lots of hidden areas and chests, lore with certain puzzles to solve. It was very massive in its scale, showing off areas you'd eventually end up in your journey along the way. Vow looked badass and felt like another great expedition into an enemy's base. The pacing of the raid is almost perfect in Vow, only being marred by the far too lengthy intro. The real first encounter was a well done introduction to the new symbols that would be used throughout the entire raid, and there were a lot of them. Vow had almost double the symbols over Last Wish, which was admittedly maybe a bit too much. The Caretaker boss fight is one of the best paced fights in the entire raid. 3 teams of 2 all splitting up to tackle the challenges of this 3-story room, and the artifacts encounter is by far the most satisfying encounter in the entire raid that rewards you for being efficient and organized, setting pathways for your team, managing which players take which artifacts per room. And there's also an element of randomness that plays in each time that meant you always needed to be ready to adapt. Another well-paced encounter that runs like a well-oiled machine once you get it down. And finally, Rolk, which is one of the more unique boss fights in Destiny's history. A final boss that actually attacks you hand to hand rather than just shooting at you from afar. Rolk can kick you off, blind you, or just land the perfect blow to end your run. There's a lot of movement when fighting him, and that's just fun. Getting up to a DPS phase is a bit of a slog though, drawn out maybe just a minute or two too long. But otherwise it's a really good fight against a unique looking villain, and thanks to some incredible lore surrounding the Witness, it made Rolk a good character even narratively, which helped alleviate some of the disappointment that Savathun wasn't the raid boss. In fact, Rolk as the raid boss felt even more fitting for what Val was going for. Again, like Beyond Light, the Witch Queen also did not bring any new PvP maps or modes to the game. Still a very puzzling decision that would continue to hurt the replayability of the Crucible. There were a fair amount of exotics added in the Witch Queen and its launch season, Season of the Risen. 8 exotic weapons and 6 exotic armor pieces. 3 of the 8 weapons were exotic glaives that were specific to each class that had some unique perks, but they really didn't make a big splash. Pretty underperforming weapons. Parasite, a heavy grenade launcher, had a pretty standard exotic quest to obtain, mostly the busywork stuff we're all used to by now, and the weapon itself could be a lot of fun for explosive enthusiasts. Collective Obligation is the new raid pulse rifle that also landed with a bit of a thud, and wasn't too strong save for a few very specific void focused builds, but even then, it wasn't all that great. Osteostriga was probably the biggest highlight of the Witch Queen weapons, and quickly became a fan favorite thanks to its viability in endgame content. And as for the Season of the Risen weapons, Dead Messenger, a secondary grenade launcher, could be obtained in an exotic quest that took place on the D1 Mars location, and the mission itself was fine enough. The weapon was also fine. And finally, Grand Overture. The Battle Pass weapon was incredibly fun to play around with, being a bit similar to Xenophage, but also having the ability to fire off tons of missiles. It was a fun exotic to use, and thankfully a pretty decent one rather than just being some gimmick weapon. The exotic armor had a few standouts amongst them, including Blight Ranger for Hunters and the Lorelei Helm for the Titans, and I'd say overall the exotics during the Witch Queen's launch were above average for most players. One of the biggest sandbox style changes that came at launch was the introduction of the first 3.0 subclass of the original 3 light subclasses, Void 3.0. Now Void 3.0 revamped the subclasses to act just like the stasis ones that granted aspects and fragments, and provided a lot of build crafting potential, which, despite a few issues, was mostly great. Considering customizable subclasses had been something highly requested ever since Destiny 2 launched, and we lost that ability to customize like we had in D1, seeing these changes finally come, even if only for the Void classes so far, was very nice to see. But we'd have to wait a few more seasons before we'd see Ark and Solar receive a similar treatment. Before we move on to Season of the Risen, I do want to address the why Witch Queen is a distraction, not an expansion idea, and most of this criticism will also apply to both Beyond Light and Shadowkeep. Now on paper it's pretty easy to see these as expansions to Destiny, but really they're more like large seasons, and there is a bit of a difference. Destiny expansions in the past have always expanded every area of the game, whether that's Crucible, Strikes, the inclusion of a brand new core playlist with Gambit, and in expansions like Taken King that introduced new enemies or events from the expansion to spread across and infect old destinations like the Taken World bosses. Bungie loves to tout that D2 is a living, breathing world that is ever changing and events take place across the system, but the last time that was ever true was in Forsaken, when every part of the game received a touch-up and even evolved a little bit. But with these last 3 expansion releases, they only pile on to the game instead of evolving it. The game doesn't need a complete overhaul or rework every year, that's not what I'm saying, but how can they say the game is evolving when every single destination or piece of content from the past has stayed the exact same? For example, in Destiny 1 during Rise of Iron, we only got 1 new strike with that expansion. However, 5 more were updated and changed to fit the new expansion theme. Tanyx had his spliced version, Sepix became perfected, the Nexus Mine became taken and gained some new abilities. The strikes actually evolved, whether they were replaced with new enemies or they were revived thanks to some sort of new tech. and the strikes had different versions even during the Taken King with which boss fight you would have at the end, or which enemies and mechanics you faced along the way. Not to mention all the new strike-specific loot that was themed around each of the enemies that was not only added to new strikes released in an expansion, but would also be added to old strikes from Vanilla Destiny, or The Dark Below or House of Wolves. Now for Destiny 2, how cool would it have been to see something like the Scarlet Keep get some of these new Hive Guardians added throughout? Or maybe even replace Hash Ladoon as a boss with a Giga Chad light-bearing wizard, or see the Inverted Spire see the addition of things like wyverns and some new mechanics thrown in for the final boss, or see literally any change made to them to fit the new theme of a new expansion. Quests were even added during the Taken King post-campaign that had us traveling all over the system with the Taken War and Wolves of Mars quests, that were in their own ways actually mini-campaigns that spanned all the destinations, further evolving those areas and giving us a reason to return to them, especially the Taken World bosses. They were all over every destination. Currently in Destiny 2, the reason I believe there's so much burnout is because each expansion only tacks on a new place to go to with a campaign and a raid, and then it's back to business as usual and leaves everything else in the dust. There's only so much you can do on one new destination before it gets boring, especially when things to do on the new destination are basically the same thing you've been doing on all of them so far. Running bounties, finding collectibles, or running the same public events you've been playing for years now. Legendary Lost Sectors helped alleviate some of that problem and did give us a reason to visit old locations, and that was great, and we need more things like that for this evolving world description to actually ring true. And of course it doesn't help when not only does old content rarely see any updates, but there is also an unhealthy lack of new content for the actual core game. And I know I've made this point like 1,000 times over the last few years, but I'll keep hammering it until something is actually done about it. The lack of core activity content, meaning Strikes, Crucible, and Gambit, in a $40 expansion, has been causing this game to grow stagnant. There are only so many times your player base can run the Arms Dealer Strike or play another Crucible match on Midtown because it becomes laughable eventually. 1 or 2 strikes in an expansion, 0 Crucible maps, and Gambit hasn't been touched in almost 4 years. And all previous destinations have absolutely no reason to exist. Expansions used to address these areas of the game, and it's why a lot of older Destiny expansions reign above the newer ones, despite the campaign's quality being improved here with the Witch Queen, because the Witch Queen's campaign is really great and so is the raid, but that's really all it has going for it. But something like Taken King and Forsaken not only overhauled core systems, but expanded every single area of the game no matter what type of player you were. The Witch Queen does not do that. It is a campaign with a few bonuses tacked on. It's just a minor distraction, not an expansion. And the same could be said for Beyond Light and Shadowkeep. And I do want to make the point that I personally love the new campaign, the raid, and the 2 strikes we got. But the rest of this game just feels wildly neglected.
I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed.
So now we move on to Season of the Risen. Story-wise, again like the Witch Queen, pretty good. The story has not really been an issue in the last few seasons, and Risen was not an exception. It told a good story tied directly into the Witch Queen and the Lucent Hive, with some good character development between some of the NPCs, and there's not really too much to dislike narratively about this season at all. The seasonal activity this time was PsyOps Battlegrounds, a 3-player match-made activity that actually had a bit of challenge to it this time, thanks to the large number of enemies it had, especially during the final boss fights. And for the most part, these were actually pretty cool. After I just spent all that time saying Witch Queen didn't give a reason to explore old areas, PsyOps did. Sort of. Unfortunately, it was still instanced and were exclusive to this seasonal playlist option, but it was cool to see old areas being utilized for some new content and actually change the existing areas with some additional architecture. I just wish these PsyOps took place in the actual patrol spaces to make the game feel more like an MMO, and not just kept to separate instances. The grind was also kept to quite a minimum for loot in PsyOps, reducing the upgrade path difficulty and kept that same kind of streamlined Umbral engram acquisition for seasonal gear. It was fine all things considered, and the weapons themselves weren't too bad either with some good roll potential. The armor, however, did not look great. The seasonal ritual weapon was Reckless Endangerment, a pretty substandard shotgun that had a lot of perk variety and options, but was truly just a jack-of-all-trades master of none, because there were infinitely just better options you could swap between that do what you want for a shotgun a bit better. Strike scoring and medals did make a return to strikes from Destiny 1, but there still wasn't a whole lot to them. In Destiny 1, these medals and scoring generally granted you bonus rewards or worked towards specific bounties from Zavala, but with strike scoring and medals added in Destiny 2, they were kind of just there. Guardian Games would also make a return this year with a new SMG to earn and at least some unique changes made. There were 3 separate strike playlists available, the recreational, training, and competitive playlists that had different modifiers and scoring systems and rewarded you a bit differently per playlist. It was an interesting idea and certainly was one of the better Guardian games we've seen, but not much of an improvement really. Season of the Risen was not a bad season. It was certainly better than the other 2 seasons that launched alongside an expansion, meaning Season of Undying and Hunt. There was better loot here, a better activity, much better story. It was still a bit on the lighter side in terms of content, but that's about par for the course for every expansion launch season. But as a whole, the Witch Queen expansion would be a major improvement over Shadowkeep and Beyond Light in almost every regard. The campaign was incredibly fun and replayable thanks to the legendary option. The raid is also one of the game's best with some killer loot to chase, and some of the few quality of life improvements did make the game feel better. But for all the good content that the Witch Queen brought to the game, its shortcomings are defined by the glaring holes left to the core game. Another expansion has come without anything substantial for the 3 pillars of the core activities, leaving the game to feel extremely stale after the honeymoon phase wears off. 3 expansions in a row this has been a problem, and Bungie seems reluctant to address those issues. Instead, the only thing to look forward to is again another 3 seasons that could hopefully surpass the formulaic and predictable gameplay loops that the community had been growing a distaste for. But only time would tell how these seasons would hold up.